Good evening, friends. Welcome to this time when we retell the story, God's story, which is our story as well. Tonight we'll be learning about how God delivers God's people from captivity to freedom. This is how the story begins. A Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. With that ominous line, the story of God's people takes a sharp downward turn. Everything goes south, so to speak, for the Hebrew nation. Pharaoh began to take notice of all of the Hebrews that were in Egypt. He became afraid of them because there were so many of them and they were working so hard and they were prospering in his nation. And so too the Egyptian people became suspicious of these others who were in their midst, taking their jobs, using up their resources, creating families of mixed origin among their people. So Pharaoh came up with a plan. First, he made all the Hebrews subservient to the Egyptians, eventually isolating them into internment camps or work camps. And when they still prospered in spite of hard labor building his cities and his infrastructure, he took away the resources they needed to build, began to provide less food for them, and finally resorted to genocide, killing all of the baby boys that were born to the Hebrews. But you know, life finds a way. And among the Hebrews, there was a woman who decided that her baby boy was the most beautiful baby of all. So when he was born, she hid him. For 3 months, she kept him hidden in their tiny little cottage. But when he became too large at 3 months to keep him hidden any longer, she took a basket, covered it with pitch, placed her beloved child in the basket, and set him free into the Nile, hoping, I think, that he would float right beyond Egypt into freedom. But just in case, she asked his older sister Miriam to follow along and see what happened. Well, wouldn't you know it? But Pharaoh's daughter was down near the river, and she saw the baby floating by. She quickly called her servants to rush into the water and haul the baby out to safety. And when she saw how precious he was, she decided to make him her own. She named him Moses. And Miriam was nearby to offer her mother, his mother's services as a wet nurse until he could be weaned. So this child, Moses, grew up with both a Hebrew identity, but all the privileges of the palace. We're not told anything about his life as a child and as a young man, except that the day arrived when he noticed a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian master. And when no one was looking, he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand, and snuck away. A few days later, he was walking through and noticed some Hebrews arguing with one another and tried to intervene. But they argued with him. "Who makes you master over us?" they asked. For some reason, this life of one foot in the palace and the other in poverty became too much for Moses to bear. And when he learned that Pharaoh was after him, probably to kill him, he escaped into the hills of Midian, outside of Egypt, and made a home there. He married a woman, had children of his own, and became a sheep herder in Midian, and would live there for many, many years. Meanwhile, the cries and agony of his people rose up to God, and we're told that God remembered his covenant with Abraham. God heard their cries. God saw the terrible circumstances of their lives, and God decided to come down. Interesting, isn't it? That in God's story, God is always coming into our lives, rescuing, redeeming, offering hope and new life to us. This time, God came down in the form of a burning bush, which did not consume the bush, but which caused Moses so much curiosity out there in the hills of Midian that he walked over to see what the bush was about. That's when he received the call of God. God would send Moses back into Egypt to rescue, redeem, and lead the people out of captivity to freedom. Well, needless to say, Moses had some doubts about this plan. But after convincing, God sent him back. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to imagine that when he arrived in Egypt, he met with some of the same arguments. Pharaoh's heart was hard. The entire economy depended on these slaves, and nobody particularly wanted to let them go. It took plagues of darkness and of gnats and of locusts and of bloody water and frogs and dying cattle and boils to convince the Egyptians and their Pharaoh to let the people go. There was one plague in particular that caused so much grief in the land of Egypt that not only was Pharaoh ready to let them go, he wanted to hurry them out. And that was the plague of the Passover, during which the angel of death took every firstborn child and firstborn animal in Egypt, but spared the Hebrews, because they had marked their doors with the blood of a lamb that they sacrificed, roasted the meat, prepared unleavened bread, and packed it all away for their quick escape that God knew would come once this final plague was visited on the people. And sure enough, when the cry arose from Egypt, from every household and every barn and every field and every chicken coop, even Pharaoh's hard heart broke. And not only did he let the people go, he hurried them out of Egypt. The people were on the move. But then Pharaoh changed his mind. When they arrived at the shore of the Red Sea, the final barrier to cross from Egypt into freedom, they looked behind them and saw that Pharaoh's army was hot in pursuit. And they became angry. They asked Moses, why in the world would he bring them out here into the desert to perish when they could have been back in Egypt? Sure, life was miserable there, but they lived. Moses struck the water with his staff, and by the power of God, the sea receded and they all could walk through on dry land into freedom. While Pharaoh's army, arriving there, trying to pursue them into this dry seabed, were flooded over and drowned. On the far side of Egypt, Miriam danced and sang, and the people celebrated that they were indeed finally free. But their joy would not last long, for indeed God led them into the desert, where they would wander for 40 years. And their lives seemed to become a cycle of complaining, questioning, crying out, and God coming to rescue. Time and again, God parted the sea. Time and again, God brought forth what they needed: water from a rock, bread spread across the ground, fresh every morning, quail to eat, safe passage. And yet they complained. Yet they wandered, and they wondered, what in the world was God up to? Well, we'll have to wait until another day to hear that part of the story. But for this week, we need to think about this God who comes down, who gets intimately involved with his people, and who acts to save. Where in your life have you seen God at work, providing what you needed, offering hope when you were hopeless, giving life when you thought you could not go on? And have you ever doubted this God, the God of your salvation? Have you questioned him? Have you wondered what God was up to? What about it? Do you look upon God with suspicion or with an attitude of surprise? The story tells us that our God is a God of surprise, and faith is a matter of waiting and trusting and anticipating with joy what God will do. Thank you for being part of this story this evening. God bless you, my friends. Amen. You know, there's nothing like a road trip to bring a family together, to clarify priorities, to have some fun, and to reveal where the cracks are. Next week, Brother Nick will be talking to us about the journey of God's people in the wilderness, how God used that time to shape them and mold them into a new community, gave them a new covenant, and offered them what we think of as the 10 Commandments, the new law. I hope you'll join Brother Nick next Sunday evening at 7 p.m. as we continue our story, God's story, and find our place in it.